Madam President, I hope this is viewed universally as a common sense bipartisan amendment, and I urge all of my colleagues to support this amendment through the roll call vote, which we will have. It's very simple, very basic, I think very appropriate. It says that for the most serious crimes that exist, violent crimes, crimes against women and children, very serious crimes by anyone's definition, that these will be disqualifiers for federal housing assistance. I bring this amendment, Madam President, for two simple reasons. First of all, I think this should go hand in hand with committing those extremely serious crimes. And again, we're not talking about threshold crimes. We're not talking about first-time drug offenses. We're talking about aggravated sexual abuse, murder, sexual exploitation of children, violence against women. Those are the four big categories. Very, very serious, very violent crimes, usually crimes focused on some of the most vulnerable in our society, like abused women and like children. So I think it's very reasonable and common sense to say these crimes have very serious consequences. And one of those, the most obvious, is a stiff jail sentence, in some cases life. But one of those consequences is also going to be the federal taxpayer is not going to give you housing or for housing. But Madam President, there's a second, I think equally maybe more important reason to support this common sense disqualifier. And it is to protect those other folks who need and use federal housing assistance and help clean up what historically has been areas that actually congregate violent crime and some of our worst social problems in federal housing projects. Madam President, I grew up in New Orleans. This has been a perennial problem in New Orleans, but I'm happy and proud to say it's a problem that's been getting better, being solved bit by bit, particularly post-Katrina. Like most major American cities, Madam President, in the 50s and 60s, huge housing projects began to be built and began to grow in New Orleans, and they were unfortunately centers of some of the worst of our social ills, particularly violent crime and drug abuse. And that's because we had policy which actually congregated, I hope that wasn't the intent, but actually tended to congregate the worst of those problems in these housing projects. And of course, that fed on itself and made many of these problems even worse, and certainly subjected innocent folks trapped in those housing projects to some of the worst problems of our big cities. In New Orleans, since Katrina, we've taken significant steps to get away from that. And so we've instituted new policy. They're less dense, these housing projects. They're more mixed income. Not 100% of the folks in these projects are subsidized. It's usually a mixed approach so that you have some market-based, some partially subsidized, some heavily subsidized, less dense environments. And so we've taken specific steps trying to learn from the horrible mistakes we made in federal housing projects, particularly in the 1960s, early 1970s. This common sense test fits in exactly with that approach. And it says we're not going to subject people in these centers of subsidized housing to the worst violence and the worst social problems that we have. We're not going to congregate violent criminals, drug abusers, others in these housing projects. And so the second compelling reason to support this Vitter amendment is with innocent folks in those housing projects and who get some subsidized housing help in mind. They deserve better, and they do not deserve to be subjected to these worst of the worst, these horrible social problems that in the past we've actually congregated in public housing projects. So again, Mr. President, I hope this is viewed as it should be, as a common sense amendment, as one that deserves wide bipartisan support. And I would also note it is extremely similar to an amendment that passed on the recent Farm Bill without controversy, the same basic rule with regard to the food stamp program. And so I urge all of my colleagues, Democrats and Republicans, to support this straightforward, reasonable amendment on the roll call vote that we will have hopefully soon. Thank you, Mr. President. With that, I yield back the floor.